America and Russia, two nations that have been locked in conflicts, struggles, and an ongoing Cold War for over 70 years. During this period, the rivalry between America and Russia turned into a struggle for dominance all over the world. Here, each nation tries to dominate the world by preventing the other from doing so, which leads to conflicts and civil wars that destroy other countries. But the question that arises is, how did America and Russia become the two most powerful countries in the world? And how did the conflict and enmity between these two nations begin in the first place? To understand the struggle between Russia and America, we need to go back in time, about 1,000 years. At that time, what we now know as Russia controlled the area you see before you, the land known as Kievan Rus, which was undergoing a period of economic progress and expanded significantly into Eastern Europe over nearly 3 centuries. At that same time, the North and South American continents were inhabited by groups of humans who had migrated from Asia, heading east about 11,000 years ago. This was a time when the continents of Asia and North America were connected by a land bridge known as the Beringia Land Bridge. These groups spread throughout North and South America, and there they formed hundreds of nations and tribes. But the bridge that connected Asia and North America began to disappear, and the sea level began to rise gradually until the bridge completely vanished about 11,000 years ago. At that time, the Bering Strait was formed and became the dividing line between the continent of Asia and the continent of North America. This caused the inhabitants living east of the Pacific Ocean to become completely isolated, with no one knowing anything about them for thousands of years. These inhabitants would later be known as the Native Americans or the Red Indians. Meanwhile, on the continent of Asia, the Mongols began to expand and get closer to the lands of Kievan Rus until they finally succeeded in destroying and occupying it in the 13th century. Here, the Mongols forced the surviving Russians to swear allegiance and pay taxes, which literally turned the Russians into servants of the Mongols. At that time, there was only one city that had the ability to fight the Mongols, the city of Muscovy, or Moscow, a city surrounded by forests and rivers that made it much more difficult for the Mongols to reach than any other region or city. The Mongols were terrifying at that time, and they literally burned and destroyed any place they entered. If we look at a map of the Mongol Empire at that time, we will find that it occupied a vast area. The area you see before you is the largest contiguous area ever held by an empire throughout history. But to control and rule an empire of such a vast size for long periods is a nearly impossible task. Therefore, the Mongol Empire began to weaken and suffer from major divisions. Here, Moscow seized the opportunity and began to expand until it finally succeeded in expelling the Mongols after an occupation that lasted about 250 years. Here, Russia decided to expand further east, and Moscow would later become the Russian Empire. After expanding in Eastern Europe, the Russians liked the process and decided to continue expanding eastward and annex more territories. Russia eventually succeeded in controlling nearly all of Siberia and finally reached the Pacific Ocean. Here, Russia was transformed into a vast empire stretching from Europe to the far east of Asia, which made it one of the most important powers on the face of the earth at that time. In Europe, the major nations began to turn toward the New World, which Christopher Columbus had discovered by chance. The lands of North and South America were divided among Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, and other countries. In the 16th century, Britain began to establish colonies of its own in the New World. Here, the Virginia colony was established to be the first British colony in the New World. Afterwards, Britain continued to establish new colonies until their number reached 13 colonies. At that time, the population in Europe was suffering greatly from economic crises, unemployment, and religious persecution. This is why large numbers of people decided to leave Europe and emigrate to America, which had become for them the land of dreams and opportunities. After controlling all of this vast area, the Russians decided to continue expanding and cross the Pacific Ocean. They eventually succeeded in controlling the northwestern part of the North American continent, the area known as Alaska. At this point, Russia stretched across 3 continents: It controlled a part of Eastern Europe and all of Northern Asia, in addition to the northwestern part of the North American continent. But Britain began to impose more taxes on the settlers, and so they eventually came together and made the decision to unite the British colonies against Britain. The American Revolutionary War began against Britain in 1775, with their main goal being liberty or death. A year later, the colonies declared their independence from Britain and established the United States of America. In the end, the new nation was victorious, and Britain finally recognized the United States in 1783. At this point, America extended from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. Initially, the Russians' goal was to continue expanding further in North America, but they collided in the east with Britain, which had expanded and annexed the lands in the north. In the south, America succeeded in expanding and annexing more lands until it reached the Pacific coast in the west. This is why Russia decided to stop expanding and be content with the vast area it had controlled. In the mid-19th century, Russia entered a war with the Ottoman Empire in the far west. Britain and France intervened and fought alongside the Ottoman Empire to weaken Russia and keep it out of colonial competition. As for America, it politically supported Russia during the war. The war ended with the victory of the Ottoman Empire and the defeat of the Russian Empire. But during this war, which lasted about 3 years, Britain and France attacked the Russian port located in the east on the Pacific coast. This made the Russians begin to feel doubtful that they would be able to protect their lands in the east. In America, the Civil War began in 1861, a war that lasted about 4 years and is considered one of the most violent wars in American history. During this war, Russia supported the American president and the Union against the separatists, and the Union finally succeeded in defeating the separatists. At that time, Russia began to feel a threat to Alaska, especially since the area had a border with their powerful enemy, Britain, which could invade the area and control it at any time. In the end, Russia decided to sell its lands in North America. Here, the choice fell on America, a nation that had good relations with Russia and at the same time was an enemy of Britain. Therefore, if this region was sold to America, America would be the barrier separating Russia and Britain. America's goal was to expand further in North America and control the largest area of the Pacific coast. This is why America saw the purchase of Alaska as an opportunity that could not be missed, especially since controlling these lands would facilitate trade with Asia for America. In the end, an agreement was reached to sell Alaska for $7.2 million. Alaska officially became a part of American territory, and the Russian presence in North America finally came to an end. In 1914, World War I began between the Allied powers, which included America, Russia, Britain, and France, and the Central Powers, led by Germany. The war ended after 4 years with the victory of the Allies and the defeat of Germany. But before the end of the war, protests began to take place all over Russia, and the Russian Empire eventually collapsed, and the era of Soviet Russia began. Here, Russia decided to withdraw from the war and made a peace treaty with Germany, leaving the Allied nations on their own. This is why the Allies, led by America, supported the opposition in Russia against the Soviet Red Army and sent troops to participate in the Civil War in Russia. In the end, the Red Army was victorious, and the establishment of the Soviet Union was announced in 1922. America refused to recognize the Soviet Union, even though all the major nations had recognized it. But with the passage of time, relations between the two nations were restored in 1933. In Europe, World War II began in 1939 between the Allied powers, which included the Soviet Union, America, Britain, and France, and the Axis powers, which included Germany, Italy, and Japan. The war ended with the victory of the Allies and the surrender of Germany and Japan. But after the end of the war, Europe suffered from destruction and weakness. Here, America and the Soviet Union emerged and became the two dominant powers in the world, marking the beginning of a new stage of conflict between the two nations that became known as the Cold War. Here, the two nations did not have any direct war between them, but they invested in proxy wars all over the world. At this time, each nation tried to dominate the world by preventing the other from doing so, which led to conflicts and civil wars that destroyed nations. The conflict between America and the Soviet Union began in Europe. Here, the Soviet Union succeeded in controlling the countries of Eastern Europe, at a time when America was leading the countries of Western Europe. This divided Europe into two parts: the Eastern Bloc, which was controlled by communist ideology led by the Soviet Union, and the Western Bloc, which was controlled by capitalist ideology led by America. The two sides were separated by the Iron Curtain. America tried to contain the Soviet expansion in the world and prevent them from exporting the communist revolution. This is why it provided economic aid to all the European countries that were suffering from destruction and poverty, totaling about $13 billion. But the Soviet Union refused this aid and prevented the Eastern Bloc countries from participating in it, because they knew that the goal of this aid was to penetrate and control these countries. With the continued Soviet expansion, America formed NATO in 1949 to be the new military force for the Western Bloc in the face of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. At that time, the Soviet Union responded and announced that it had finally succeeded in creating the nuclear bomb, making the Soviet Union the second nuclear power in the world after America. Afterwards, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 so that the Eastern Bloc could confront the capitalist threat led by America. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union succeeded for the first time in history in sending an artificial satellite and a human into space. This was considered a declaration of the superiority of Soviet communism over the American capitalist system. Afterwards, America responded and created the Apollo program, and it finally succeeded in sending the first human to the moon. America continued to help its allies and intervene in many regions in the world. And at the same time, the Soviet Union succeeded in exporting the communist revolution and gained many allies. In China, the establishment of the People's Republic of China was announced, allowing the Soviet Union to add a quarter of the world's population to the communist camp. In Europe, America placed nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, which the Soviet Union considered a threat. Afterwards, in the Caribbean region, which is very close to America, the Soviet Union succeeded in getting closer to Cuba and placing nuclear missiles there, facing America. This brought the world close to a global nuclear war. But in the end, an agreement was reached, and the Soviet Union withdrew from Cuba. In return, America pledged not to invade Cuba and to remove the nuclear missiles from Italy and Turkey. In Vietnam, America entered the war and supported South Vietnam against the North, which was supported by the Soviet Union and China. The war ended with the victory of North Vietnam and the withdrawal of America, allowing the communists to take control of all of Vietnam. In the Middle East, Egypt was attacked by Israel, France, and Britain with the goal of controlling the Suez Canal. Here, the Soviet Union supported its allies in Egypt and threatened to use nuclear weapons. In the end, America intervened and ended the attack. In Iran, the revolution succeeded in toppling the rule of the Shah, and Iran officially became an Islamic republic hostile to American policies. Afterwards, the Soviet Union succeeded in occupying Afghanistan to support the communist government loyal to them. At that time, the Soviets faced strong resistance from the Muslim revolutionaries, who were supported by America and other countries. In the end, the Soviet army was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan after a war that lasted 10 years. The Soviet economy began to suffer due to the cost of the war and a lack of agricultural and industrial production. This is why protests took place all over the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Here, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to fall one after another. Afterwards, the republics of the Soviet Union began to separate, and the Soviet Union eventually collapsed and officially ended in 1991. At this point, America became the only superpower on the face of the Earth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO, led by America, began to expand further into Central and Eastern Europe to get closer to the Russian borders. Afterwards, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which were a part of the Soviet Union, seized the opportunity and joined the European Union and NATO to protect themselves from Russia and begin integrating with Europe. Here, Russia began to feel threatened and began to take a stand against any country that was a part of the Soviet Union and was thinking of joining NATO. Georgia, which has a border with Russia in the south and was a part of the Soviet Union, tried to join the European Union and NATO. Here, Russia supported the separatists in the Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions who wanted to separate from Georgia. It provided them with military aid and granted their residents Russian citizenship. In 2008, it carried out its first military invasion since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The war ended with Russia's victory after only 5 days, and Russia announced its recognition of the independence of the Abkhazia and South Ossetia regions, which still have no international recognition. Afterwards, Ukraine, which was also a part of the Soviet Union, began to think about joining the European Union and NATO and made a cooperation agreement with the European Union in 2013, led by the Ukrainian president Yanukovych. But at that time, Russia pressured Ukraine in every possible way. Here, the Ukrainian president decided to suspend the agreement. But at that time, large protests took place in Ukraine that forced the president to flee to Russia in February 2014. Here, Russia seized the opportunity and took control of the Crimean Peninsula, which it considers a part of its national security and its passage to the Black Sea. From that time on, Crimea has been under complete Russian control. At that time, fear began to grow that Russia's next step might be Poland, or one of the 3 Baltic states. This is why NATO increased its military presence in the Baltic states. But Russia responded by deploying ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads in the Russian province of Kaliningrad, located in Central Europe. This caused all of Europe and NATO to turn their attention towards Kaliningrad. In February 2022, Russia began the war on Ukraine. Here, the focus increased even more on the Kaliningrad region, where nuclear missiles capable of destroying European capitals like Berlin, Warsaw, Copenhagen, and Stockholm are located. The Russian military presence in the region poses a major threat to NATO, but the greater threat is the corridor leading to the region, the Suwalki Gap, which is about 65 kilometers long and connects Russia's ally, Belarus, to Kaliningrad via Polish and Lithuanian territory. Russia has a pincer on this corridor. Its first jaw is Kaliningrad, where thousands of Russian forces and Iskander ballistic missiles are deployed. Its second jaw is Russia's ally, Belarus, where Russia can easily deploy its nuclear weapons. This corridor has become the only link for the Baltic states with NATO and the European Union. So, if Russia decides to escalate for any reason, this corridor will give a great opportunity for Russian forces to advance from both sides through Kaliningrad and Belarus and deploy their forces along the 65 kilometers. This would allow them to control the entire corridor and isolate the Baltic states located north of the corridor from Poland and the rest of the European Union. This makes this area a point of strength for Russia in its conflict with NATO. And with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and on the other side, with the rise of China and its clear alignment with Russia, it is now perfectly clear that the conflict and Cold War between Russia and America are still ongoing.